It's been a wonderful series.
Wow.
Pleasure.
Okay, I'm going to start because we've got it's 7:59. So on my watch, it's 7:59. So in the olden days, you used to show 5 minutes beforehand, 10 minutes beforehand, find parking. Now it's just click. Is everyone's okay with the temperature? Yeah, okay. You're in your own home, so. I just want to see someone to complain about the temperature. Then I'll feel like it's a real shul event.
I'm really cold.
Okay, thank you.
We have Cyril Press with us tonight. Dr. Cyril Press. Hi, my friend. From Sheret Tzedek. I know this one.
Okay, we're officially at 8 o'clock, so we begin. So this is our last class with Rabbi Becher for this period of 6 classes. When I started off, the class, I said, wow, we're speaking about such a wide variety of things. Usually when we have speakers, they have an expertise. We had a speaker that spoke about his experiences in the NFL. We have speakers that speak about medicine and halacha, speakers that are experts in Jewish history, but not so often we find someone that can speak about almost every topic, which is why I think it adds a lot to every class that when someone has the macro picture of everything else going on. And that's what we've had at the last 5 classes with Rabbi Becher. The last class is actually very important to me because it's about eating. Now, there was once I'm reading a book, it's actually about health, Jewish health, and the writer writes that he actually had a daily or a weekly chavrusa study partner with the Maggid of Yerushalayim, Rav Shlomo or Shalom. Does anyone want to correct Shvadron?
Shalom Shvadron.
Shalom Shvadron. Not an easy name to pronounce. His brother-in-law was the great Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and he learned with him at 5 or 5:30 in the morning, this particular doctor. And he started off his day by going for a jog at 4 o'clock in the morning. So he's a little bit awkward about jogging in Yerushalayim. He was an older doctor, but he knew it's the right thing to do to jog. So every day he would get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and jog. And sure enough, you go jogging in Yerushalayim at 10 o'clock in the morning, you bump into a lot of people. But you go jogging at 4 o'clock in the morning, you're not bumping into anyone. And sure enough, he bumps into who? He bumps into the Rabbi Shvadron, the famous Maggid of Yerushalayim, the same rabbi he was going to be learning with at 5 o'clock. And he was going out for a walk, and this doctor was going out for a jog. And he was schwitzing, and he was all embarrassed. He got home, he showered, and he showed up at 5 o'clock to the rabbi's house to study. So the rabbi said to him, how was your jog this morning? He said, it was a nice jog. He says, did you make a prayer called Hareini Muchan Umazumad, L'kayim es mitzvos Shmartem es nafsho seichem? Did you make a little prayer, not a blessing, but a prayer that before you went jogging, that you're jogging to fill the mitzvah of be healthy? That's one of the 613 commandments. He says, what do you mean? He says, if you're jogging, why are you jogging? You're jogging for God. You're jogging to be healthy, to live longer. And so why not start off every jog with a little prayer that you're jogging for God and not for vanity, although, and not for other things, but you're jogging for Hashem. In other words, everything that you're doing, you have a way of sanctifying it. Jews have a way of tying our shoes, or putting on our shoes. We have a way of how we clean ourselves. We're in the washroom. To everything, there is a course of action because we don't consider the shul life to be only the time we serve God. We serve God wherever we are and in every moment. Every moment is an opportunity to serve God. And so something that God created within us that we have to eat, we have to eat God didn't have to create us this way. God created us, but we have to eat. And I do that mitzvah so seriously. I eat all the time. But God gave us the mandate to eat. And so it's something that we do maybe, an hour a day if you break up breakfast, lunch, and supper. If you counted buying food, cleaning food, cleaning your dishes, and eating food probably consumes, no pun intended, 2 hours of the day at least. So we're going to hear about food and stuff like that, but just let's appreciate we dedicate probably 20% of our lives to food. We earn money for food. It's at least something that we should think about as we put food into our mouth, why we're doing it. We're doing it to live a long life, to give Hashem nachas. So without further ado, we call up Achron Chava. Maybe our last class is the most important, as they say. All classes are important, but it's a great honor to have Rabbi Becher with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here as usual. And tonight we are talking about Jewish gastronomy, why we eat, what we eat. And now, the very first mitzvah that God gave to humanity, the first statement that God made to humanity was, listen carefully, Mikol eitz hagan achol tochel, ume'etz hadas toivera lo soichlu mimenu, which means this: from all the fruit of the trees of the garden you shall eat, except for from the fruit of the tree of knowledge. So it is interesting that before God said to Adam and Eve, don't eat from the tree of knowledge, what he said to them was, eat from all the other trees, as an imperative and indeed as a mitzvah. And the Meshech Chochmah of Meir Simcha Udvinsk points out that really God wants us to enjoy and take pleasure in his world. And when we do enjoy his world and we are grateful for it, we become better people. And he says not partaking of that which is permitted to partake of in God's world is in a sense throwing the gift back at God's face. And so food, very important. John Cooper, who wrote a seminal work on Jewish gastronomy that he called Eat and Be Satisfied. He is a professor at Oxford University. He describes the Jews as a gastrocentric people, right? Gastrocentric. And he is 100% correct, right? There's a lot of Judaism that focuses around food. So let me talk about a few different categories of food. Some foods are actually halachically obligatory based on Jewish law. Let me start with one food, which is virtually at every Jewish event. It is the first thing a Jewish boy tastes after his mother's milk. It is the first thing we have as a married couple together. It is something which we have every Sabbath and every festival. It is something with which we celebrate on every single time we have a festive meal. And that is wine. Wine is a quintessential Jewish food. Wine was considered to be and is the epitome of the blessing of the land of Israel. When the prophets want to describe prosperity, peace, and joy of the Jews in the land of Israel, the prophets would say, Ish tachat gefano, each man under his vine, drinking the wine. And it's interesting, Israel was very famous for wine in the ancient world. We actually have amphorae with remnants of wine. Well, you can tell that wine was in them, that were exported from Israel to the Roman world. But, of course, as you well know, after the Romans destroyed the temple approximately 2,000 years ago, Jews were not producing wine in the land of Israel until 1880s, when Baron Edmund de Rothschild established the Carmel Winery in Rishon LeZion, around there, right? Rishon LeZion. And he established the Carmel Winery, and he produced the first bottles of wine produced by Jews in Israel in 2,000 years. What a momentous event. And he sent bottles to various Jewish dignitaries around the world. One of them, to whom he sent a crate of wine, was Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin. Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin was the very famous head of the Volozhin Yeshiva in Lithuania. Now it's in Belarus. Then it was called Lithuania. The Volozhin Yeshiva was considered the mother of yeshivas, the most famous yeshiva. The Netziv, Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, was the head of that yeshiva. He was also the figurehead of the Chovevei Tzion movement, one of the early religious Zionist movements, and he supported the settlement of the land of Israel. By the way, he had two sons. One was Rabbi Chaim Berlin, who was a rabbi in Moscow, and a yeshiva is named after him in New York. And another son was Rabbi Meir Berlin, who moved to Israel, changed his name to Bar Ilan, and there's a university named after him called Bar Ilan University in Israel. So they send a crate of wine to Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, the head of the Volozhin Yeshiva. When he hears that wine has arrived from Israel, he goes into his room and changes into his Shabbos clothing to greet wine from Israel. When he is given the bottle of wine and he sees on it Hebrew writing, kosher, produced in the land of Israel, Carmel wineries, Rishon LeZion. When he reads the label, he starts crying. He cried in joy and with emotion of understanding that wine, that wine which is mentioned in the Torah many, many times, which is the symbol of prosperity and joy of the Jews in the land of Israel, symbol of blessing of the land of Israel, he cried. And Rashi, Reb Shlomo Yitzchaki, the great commentator on virtually everything written, who lived in the 11th century in Troyes, in Spain, in France, in the Champagne region, also produced wine. And, but he wasn't producing wine in the land of Israel. He was a wine merchant, and everyone in Champagne region produced wine in the appropriate season. It's an amazing and beautiful picture that you can see of that. Rashi tells us in his commentary on the Gemara in Sanhedrin, he says one of the greatest indications of the redemption is when the land of Israel starts to flower and give forth its fruits for the Jewish people. And today, Israel is a producer of wine, of world-class wines in the Golan Heights, volcanic soil, cooler climate, all the way down to the coastal regions, warmer climate, the Judean hills. Wines produced all over Israel, fantastic, world-class, amazing wines. And part of the significance of wine is what? Think about it. We all start off as grape juice. Grape juice is a sweet, not very good. It's okay for juice boxes for little kids, but who likes grape juice? Seriously? Right? Grape juice is this sweet drink, not very good, no bouquet, not much depth, no alcohol, no variety, just grape juice. What does it take to turn grape juice into wine? It must go through a process of fermentation. Fermentation symbolizes to us the struggle against evil, external and internal, the struggle of perfection. Everyone has to go through fermentation. But when we go through fermentation, we become a superior product. We become something called wine. So wine symbolizes that beautiful, beautiful idea of the end of struggle. And that's why wine symbolizes blessing, because it is the blessing that comes as a result of struggle, not despite the struggle, but because of the struggle, because of the fermentation. And hence we drink wine at all of those occasions, because wine symbolizes to us what life is all about and that ultimate blessing that comes from that fermentation and from that struggle. In Kabbalistic literature, we know that certain colors represent different sephirot, different of the modalities of God's activities in this world. We discussed when we spoke about Kabbalah, that there's such a thing as din, which is strict justice, and there is chesed, which is kindness. Milk is white, is the symbol of chesed, kindness. Red is blood, the symbol of din, of justice. Wine is considered din metukan, meaning justice, but justice in its ideal form, meaning you've gone through the struggle, the fermentation, the bitterness, but now what you come out with in the end is something much superior and wonderful, which is wine. And that's why we drink it so often. A custom regarding wine, which is a type of an interesting custom that I'm sure you're all familiar with, which is, what do we do when we drink wine? Aside from the regular blessings we say on food, we say l'chaim. Anyone? I'm sure you're all familiar with that. L'chaim, we say l'chaim. We have wine or alcohol or whatever, we say l'chaim. What is the origin? How far does that go back? Does it go back further than Fiddler on the Roof? The answer is yes. In fact, there is a 13th century work, the Kolbo, who says that it is an ancient custom in his time for Jews to say l'chaim when they would drink wine. And he gives a number of reasons for that. He says, reason number one, according to one opinion, the fruit that Adam and Eve ate was the fruit of the vine. And that did not turn out well. That didn't create life, that created the opposite. So when we drink wine, we want to emphasize to ourselves that it needs to create not the opposite, but it has to create life. And so we say l'chaim. The second reason he gives is that the first time wine is explicitly mentioned in the Torah, in Genesis, is Noah. Noah comes out of the ark, plants a vineyard, the grapes mature, he makes wine, he gets drunk, tragedy ensues, he is humiliated by his sons. There's a whole, it may be even worse, terrible stuff. So it doesn't create life, it creates the opposite. So when we drink wine, we want to remind ourselves this should only be for positive things, l'chaim, life. Third reason he gives is that when a criminal would be given a capital punishment in the Sanhedrin back in the days that we had a court system in Israel that was judging by Jewish law, they give capital punishment. So we are told that the women in Jerusalem would create a beverage made of wine and narcotics. And before this person was executed, he would be given this mixture of wine and narcotics in order to anesthetize him so he would not feel pain. Obviously, when they gave him that, that was not a symbol of l'chaim, to life. That was the opposite. So when we drink wine, we always say l'chaim, for life. So those are some of the ideas behind wine. And by the way, interestingly, according to some commentaries, when the Torah speaks about a land flowing with milk and honey, that Israel is the land flowing with milk and honey. As you all know, honey does not refer to bees' honey, it refers to date honey. Dates is a fruit of the land of Israel with which the land of Israel is blessed. And the dates, actually, you can make a fantastic honey. It's called silan, which is a type of a date syrup, date honey that is used for flavoring. And actually, according to Biblical Archaeology Review, beer that was drunk in biblical times was often flavored with different things. One of the things that beer was flavored with in biblical times was silan, which is the date honey. So a land flowing with milk and honey, the honey refers to date honey. What is the milk? What is milk referring to? You might think milk refers to dairy foods like tenuva od kapit and stuff like that. No, it does not refer to that. According to some of our commentaries, it refers to white wine. Milk of the land of Israel is the white wine that is produced in Israel, which in ancient times was quite strong and usually had to be diluted. Red wine is the preferable wine. So at the Seder, you're supposed to drink red wine because that everyone at the Seder has to drink, right? Men and women and children, old and young, everyone has to drink 4 cups. So we want to have wine which is not so strong. And in those days, the red wine was not as strong as the white wine. Just a parenthetical point, which is not so pleasant, is that the Rav Moshe Isserles, who lived in Krakow in the 16th century, writes in the Code of Jewish Law that it is a custom of the Ashkenazim that in places where there are blood libels, we only use white wine at the Seder. So we should not be accused of putting blood in the wine, because unfortunately, as you know, Christians used to accuse Jews of the blood libel, Muslims too, but Christians more often. And hence we wanted to do everything we could to avoid that accusation. And so even though red wine is preferable at the Seder, a lot of Jews specifically used to use white wine to avoid the blood libel condemnation. The next most common food we find that is eaten at every meal that Jews call a meal. In fact, in Jewish law, it's only called a real meal if you have this food, and that is bread. And bread is actually mentioned in Genesis. God tells Adam, "Bezeas apecha toicha lechem," by the sweat of your brow you shall eat bread. You shall have to labor hard for the bread, and you have to produce bread. And it's interesting. So what does bread symbolize? Why is bread so important? I mean, if you could have a massive Japanese feast, teppanyaki feast, and you would not say the grace after meals. You'd say a small blessing afterwards, but grace after meals, no. Right? You can have a massive Chinese banquet, no grace after meals. Why? Only if you have bread. Bread appears to be the quintessential human food, much more than any other food. And what is the reason for that? So there are many reasons for it, but one is based on a story in which there was a Roman called Tyrannus Rufus, used to often debate the rabbis. He came to Rabbi Akiva and he said to her, and I may have told this story, I don't know if I did or not, but he tells Rabbi Akiva, he says, "Which is better? You tell me, Rabbi, the deeds of God or the deeds of man?" And what he meant to do was, he meant to ask Rabbi Akiva the following: if you tell me the deeds of God are superior to those of the human, I will then ask, how can you dare change anything in this world? How do you have the chutzpah to do circumcision? How do you have the chutzpah to trim your hair? How could you change this world if God's actions are superior? And if you tell me human actions are superior to God, I will then say that you are a heretic. So Tyrannus Rufus figures he's got Rabbi Akiva in an arm bar, submission hold, MMA, tap out, that's it, it's over. So Rabbi Akiva says, "Just a second, mate," doesn't answer immediately, goes to the fridge, comes back with a stalk of wheat in one hand and a 3-layer chocolate mousse cake in the other, a Sacher torte, Sacher, which was actually originally a Jewish bakery in Vienna that perfected a moist chocolate cake with a hint of raspberry running through it. It's called the Sacher Bakery, right? And the Sacher Bakery, and by the way, the most famous bakery in Calcutta is actually Nachman's Bakery, which was a Jewish bakery, no longer kosher, but it was over 100 years ago when it was founded by Iraqi Jews. In any case, the Sacher Bakery, which is no longer kosher, they have a cake called the Sacher torte, which is chocolate cake with a hint of raspberry, very moist chocolate cake, 3 layers, milk chocolate mousse, dark chocolate mousse, and milk and white chocolate mousse, and shavings of chocolate on top, little dulce de leche around the side to garnish, and some nutmeg. Anyway, Rabbi Akiva, I'm sorry, I'm getting hypoglycemic, 1 second. All right. So anyway, Rabbi Akiva comes over to Tyrannus Rufus with a stalk of wheat in one hand and the chocolate mousse cake in the other. And he says, "You tell me which is better, deeds of God," waves around the stalk of wheat, "deeds of man," waves around the Sacher torte. So what was Rabbi Akiva trying to teach us? He was teaching us an important lesson in Jewish philosophy, which is that God did not create a perfect world. He created a world designed to be perfected. And we are the agents of that perfection. So in the same way that you do not take wheat, even if you're a complete vegan maniac, no offense to the maniacs by comparison to vegans, but even if you are, you do not take a stalk of wheat and go, "Oh, delicious, much better than your porterhouse steak." No, we do not do that. What do you do with the wheat? You have to actually go through many, many processes till it turns into bread. In fact, bread, which is a staple in societies all over the world, in all different types of bread, whether it's naan or chapati, right, or challah or pita or Iraqi bread or lafa, etc., etc. It's all over the place because bread is the quintessential Jewish human food, because it represents the ability of the human being to take this world and to refine it and to perfect it and to turn it into something which is far superior to the original creation. And that is our job. And that's why whenever we Jews sit down to a meal, and it's considered to be an important meal, Shabbat, Yom Tov, the meal of a wedding, Sheva Brachot, celebration for the week after, a bris milah, whatever it is, we always begin with bread. Because bread to us symbolizes what the human is all about, what life is all about, which is taking the raw product of creation, including myself, and perfecting it and turning it into something far, far better, which is the bread. And that's why bread is so central in all of Jewish tradition. Let's move along here to some foods which are not necessarily obligatory, like bread and wine, but they are based on legal concepts. I'll give you a few examples of that. And the most famous example is something called adafina. Anyone heard of adafina? Sometimes known as sahina, sometimes known as tofina, sometimes known as tibet, sometimes called shalet, sometimes called cholent. That you've probably heard of. I think we have an Ashkenazi crowd here, right? Now, what is this dish? This dish, most dishes are defined by their ingredients. Not so adafina, cholent, orisa, sechina, etc. In fact, the oldest term for it is chamin. Chamin, which just means hot stuff. And it's mentioned already in the Talmud, it's mentioned in the commentaries on the Talmud. And what's the idea behind it? It's eaten when? It's always eaten on Shabbat, on the Sabbath. And the idea behind it is the following. There was a group known as Karaites. Karaite comes from the Hebrew word kara, which means to read. The Karaites were the readers. Those were people who believed only in the 5 books of Moses, in the literal reading of the 5 books of Moses. They eventually modified that, but initially they believed only in the literal reading of the 5 books. And as you all know, right, Jews, mainstream Jews, we're not literalists. We don't, right? And we have something called the oral Torah, which elaborates upon and expands on the 5 books of Moses and the writings and the prophets and so on and so forth. And we have a vast oral tradition. The Karaites rejected that. Karaites began in around the 8th, 9th century. Combated by Rav Sargon and Maimonides, etc. The Karaites were a major force amongst the Jews. Now, the Karaites read the Torah the following. It says in the Torah regarding Sabbath, it says, Lo tavaru eish b'chol moshvotechem b'yom HaShabbat. Don't light a fire in your dwellings on the Sabbath. Now, the Karaites read that. Don't have a fire burning in your home on the Sabbath. So in a Karaite home on Sabbath, you would sit in the dark, eat cold food, and have no heating on. There are probably not a lot of Karaites in Toronto, I'm guessing, right? Right. So that was Karaites. So in a Karaite family, the husband would come down the stairs Friday afternoon, and he said, "Honey," she says, "Yes, it's almost Shabbat. Did you blow out the candles?" So they would eat cold food. Now, one of the ways in which the rest of the Jews, that's us, the Rabbinites, those who believe in the oral tradition, because the oral tradition says what it means is you're allowed to have fire in the house on Shabbat. We light candles, we have lights, we have heating, and you can have hot food. So if I had hot food Friday night, that would not prove that I am not a Karaite, because it could have been heated before Shabbat. But if I have hot food Shabbat lunchtime, what does that prove? That proves my belief in the oral tradition. And in fact, there was a rabbi from Lunel in Provence, known as Rav Zrachia Halevi. He wrote a book called Hamaor HaKatan, the small light, which refers to the moon, because Lunel in Provence, city of the moon. In any case, Rav Zrachia Halevi writes that Yesh Omrim, some say that it's a decree of the sages to eat hot food Shabbat lunchtime. And anyone who refuses to eat it, we have to check and make sure that he's not a heretic. So a person who says, I don't want the cholent, everyone's looking at him like, oh, what's going on, right? Because he might be a Karaite. So really, well before marijuana, cholent was the ultimate protest food, right? It was a food that Jews would eat to demonstrate, first of all, enjoy Shabbat, and secondly, to demonstrate our belief in the oral tradition. Now, it's interesting, to such a degree, this is true, it became such a typical Jewish dish, eating this to such a degree that, let me read to you from the Register of Depositions of the Inquisition in July 1570. This is in the Canary Islands, which is the westernmost islands of Spain. I actually have a student at Yeshiva University who's from the Canary Islands. And the Inquisition was, of course, directed at Christians and to make sure that anyone who said they're Christian really was Christian. So obviously, from the time of 1391, when the riots broke out against the Jews in Spain, and a lot of Jews converted to Christianity, but they secretly kept Judaism, the Inquisition was always making sure that there was no secret Jews known as anusim or crypto Jews. one of the most classic dishes. Listen to what it says here. This is the record. Ana Gonzalez, she was a maid of a Jewish family in the Canary Islands, deposes that when she was in the service of Anna de Belmonte, she saw that her mistress cooked mutton with oil and onions and left it cooking for a long time. And she understood this is the Jewish dish adafina. During the Inquisition, the most incriminating food that a Jew could eat would be adafina, which comes from the Arabic to conceal. So adafina became the Jewish dish, and it became a Jewish dish that symbolized here was a Jew who was still keeping the Shabbat. And it has many variations because the dish is not defined by its ingredients. Every community has a completely different chamin. As I said, in the classic adafina that was made in Spain, which is today made in Morocco, is made with onions and garlic and chickpeas and paprika and cumin and cinnamon, coriander, turmeric, saffron, salt, black pepper, lamb. Oh my gosh, this is awesome stuff. And always in the Sephardi chamin, there was always haminados, which is slow cooked eggs. They'd put an egg in there and let it cook together, and it would absorb the flavor through the shell of the rest of the adafina. In some communities in Calcutta, it was made. Chamin was made. It was made with rice and curry and chicken. And when it cooked until Shabbat lunchtime, what would happen is, I don't know the physics of this or the chemistry, but the rice forms into 3 layers. The bottom layer is crispy, the middle layer is fluffy plain rice, and the top layer is rice soaked in the curry and chicken juices. And I've had it, it's amazing, absolutely incredible. Ashkenazi Jews in Eastern Europe would have it primarily made of potatoes and beans and barley. The Jews in Germany would also add a dumpling to it. And Jews in Poland would add a stuffed intestine stuffed with fat and garlic and onion and flour and cooked in the cholent, and that would be called a kishka. Kishka literally means intestine. You didn't actually eat the intestine, that was just the skin that was used to cover it. And this became the quintessential Jewish dish. And as I said, it's not in fact, every family has different ingredients. I don't even want to go into the Borough Park ketchup controversy of 1978, which ended in violence. But nevertheless, that is what we call cholent. Now, interesting, cholent also contributed to society something else. Anyone ever heard of Irving Naxon? Irving Naxon was a Lithuanian Jew who lived in Boston in the early 20th century, mid 20th century. Irving Naxon was an inventor. He has 200 patents to his name. And his mother from Lithuania used to tell him that it was common in the poor Jewish communities of Lithuania. What people would do is they didn't have ovens that they could leave on from Friday all the way through Shabbat. No such thing. But the bakery, the local bakery, the oven of the local bakery retained heat for a long time, and the residual heat could cook things for hours and hours afterwards. So what people would do is send the kids with a pot of cholent. They'd take it to the bakery oven Friday afternoon, and everyone's name would be on it. They'd put the pot in the oven, and then after shul, after synagogue, they'd come and collect it and bring it home, and you'd have your cholent. By the way, the word cholent, adafina, as I said, is Arabic for something which is buried, because they used to cook it by burying it in type of hot stuff, hot coals, etc., and covering it. It's called hatmana, buried. But the Ashkenazim, cholent, some say comes from the French chaud and lent, which means hot and cold, hot and slow. So it was hot and slow food. Some say it was sholont, meaning after shul. Ant shul, after shul, because you'd pick up the food after shul from the bakery oven. So anyway, they'd pick it up from the bakery oven and take it home. So Irving Naxon starts to think, what if I could duplicate that slow residual heat of the bakery oven in Lithuania with electricity? And you could put something in there and let it cook for ages, and it will cook slowly and produce a cholent-like dish. And he invented it, and he called it the Naxon Beanery. The Naxon Beanery is not such a great name for sales. It's not good for marketing. So the name was eventually changed to the Crockpot. And so the Crockpot had its origins back with the Karaite-Rabbinite dispute in Israel and Iraq in the Middle East, moved over to Provence, where the rabbi said, you must eat a hot stew, moved from there to Lithuania, where they'd put it in the bakery oven to cook until Shabbos lunchtime, and moved from there to Boston, where it got electricity and became known as the crockpot. So if anyone here uses a crockpot, you can thank Irving Naxon of Boston, and you can thank his mother from Lithuania, and Rav Zrachia Halevi from Provence, and the Karaites from 9th century Babylon. So that is as far as the cholent goes. I want to say also cholent features in a lot of stories. There's one, this in his book, Eat and Be Satisfied, by, I mentioned him before, John Cooper. He quotes from a fellow by the name of Captain James Riley. In 1815, he was an American captain who, sorry, my focus. Okay, he was an American captain who had gone to the Mediterranean with the United States had sent the Navy over to combat Arab pirates in the Mediterranean, and his ship was sunk, and he was washed ashore, and he was actually, he went through horrific stuff. He ends up in Morocco. And in Morocco, he is hosted by a Jewish family who he initially thought was a royal family. Why? Because he turned up there on Shabbat. Everyone's wearing beautiful clothing. There are lights are lit all over the house, beautiful oil-filled chandelier, amazing stuff. He says they all were holding books. Even the children could read. He was shocked by that. Evidently, he was from New Jersey. And he sees they're all literate. And not only that, he says the food was incredible, and he describes in his travelogue, this is from 1815, an American naval captain running into some Jews for Shabbos in Morocco. You can't imagine a greater cultural gap. But he writes, he says, the Jews' principal and standing Sunday dinner, he keeps calling it Sunday dinner because he can't conceive of Shabbos being on Saturday. It's just like, so he keeps calling it Sunday. Okay. He says, Sunday dinner is called sahina. Right? It is made of chickpeas baked in an oven for nearly 24 hours with a quantity of beef marrow bones broken to pieces over. It is very, very luscious and fattening dish, and by no means a bad one. This is eaten with vegetables and some plum pudding, a good bread, and Jew's brandy distilled from figs and aniseed. This is known as arak. Some of you may have had it. The Sephardi, the Syrian Jews, many of them live in Flatbush, but there's a big Syrian Jewish community in Deal, which is on the Jersey shore. And the Jews of Deal have a brand of arak, which is the best arak in the world. It's known as Zahlawi. And they make it in the way that has been made for 1,000 years in Babylon, in Iraq, from figs and aniseed. It's an amazing Zahlawi arak. And he writes about how these Jews used to have the arak with their Shabbat meal. So, and by the way, Joe Nathan, one of the most famous recipes for cholent is from Amnon Lipkin Shachak. Anyone ever heard of him? He was former chief of staff of the Israeli army, grew up in Hebron, and has a recipe for cholent which is mind-blowing, and it's actually a combination of Ashkenazi and Sephardi cholent together. So it's pretty amazing. And I actually was a chaplain in the Israeli army, in the IDF. And I can tell you that according to Israeli army has a absolute requirement by army rules that every base must make a cholent on Shabbos. And there's actually an official army recipe for it, which is actually not very good, but they do have cholent. Okay, let's move along here to another type of famous Jewish food, which is also has some type of a legal basis, which is known as gefilte fish. Gefilte fish is ground fish. On the Sabbath, one of the prohibitions on Sabbath is filleting fish. You're not supposed to remove bones from the fish. You can eat fish, by taking the flesh and eating it, which is normal eating. But to prepare it by removing bones, problematic. The problem is if you don't remove bones from fish, you're going to be doing the Shabbat dinner to the Heimlich maneuver. So while I love my family, I don't really want to be doing Heimlich maneuvers all through Shabbat, prevent choking on bones. So Jews invented a way of, they'd fillet the fish before Shabbat, grind it up. You'd then take the ground fish and spice it. And afterwards, yes, I will give class notes with some recipes afterwards. I will be sending them to Rabbi Mordechai and Rabbi Carfunkel. You'll get a lot of these recipes and the notes. Don't worry. And they would grind it up, and then you'd boil it in a mixture with celery and onion and carrots. And the fish would, some people, there are major arguments whether you have the sweet gefilte fish or the sour gefilte fish. I think I may have mentioned it in my class about the Hasidic Rebbes, the famous story of the sweet and sour gefilte fish. So I won't go through that again. But basically, the Jews of Poland would very often have it sweet. They'd have sugar in it, and others not. But that was to prevent the selection of bones from the fish. Now, let me move along here to some foods that are based on historic concepts. Purim is our next major festival. On Purim, as you all know, what is the famous Purim food? Wrong. Someone just said Hamantaschen. So actually, let me let you in on a secret, right? The Jewish food for Purim is based on a verses in Daniel. Daniel the prophet was a youth taken from Israel to Babylon at the time of the destruction of the temple. He and a number of teenagers were selected by the Babylonian court. They wanted to train them to work in the Babylonian court. They knew Jews were smart. These were teenagers from prestigious families. So they said, yeah, but they need to be fattened up because they're war victims. They're not looking too healthy. So the king tells his steward to fatten them up. Daniel says, we're not going to eat the king's food. It's not kosher. What does Daniel and his friends eat? He says, just give us poppy seeds and water and we'll be fine. So they subsisted on poppy seeds and water, and they were healthy miraculously. To commemorate the heroism of Daniel and his teenage friends, Rav Moshe Isserles writes in the Code of Jewish Law that it became customary to eat poppy seed foods on Purim. Now, can anyone tell me what poppy seeds are in German or Yiddish? Mon. Now, being Jewish, we don't just eat poppy seeds. We take the poppy seeds, we mix them with honey and raisins. We wrap them in dough, make a round dough, fold it over so you have a triangular shape. You then sprinkle it with some sugar and you bake it. And what you have is a pocket of poppy seeds. A pocket is a taschen, a little bag is a taschen. And mon is poppy seeds. So actually the original name was Montaschen. So what we actually are supposed to eat on Purim are Montaschen. Someone at some point in history around the 17th century decided that mon sounds a lot like homon and added a hey to the front of it, and it became Hamantaschen. And then people came up with bizarre theories about Haman and what it's got to do with Haman and his ears. He's like a Vulcan, right? And whatever else, all types of crazy stuff about his hat was, who knows? But really, the origin is Montaschen. It is eating poppy seeds because of the heroism of Daniel and his friends back in the day of the Babylonian and Persian Empire. So when it comes to Purim, as I always tell my children, we do not call them Hamantaschen in our house. We call them Montaschen, which I get lots of excellent eye rolls and whatevers from the kids, which is, of course, my goal. Now, another food which we often have is, you may have heard of it, Ashkenazim call it Daniel. What does Daniel have to do with Purim? Daniel was one of the first. Purim took place in Babylon, but Persia, Babylon. That was where the Jews went after the destruction of the first temple. And those are some of the first exiles who went there. Daniel was amongst them. And so we got out of the Babylonian exile as a result of Purim, got it back to Israel. So that's what it's got to do with it, etc. Now, I should mention, we have certain foods which are of an economic nature, based on economics. For example, according to Torah law, did you know that locusts, the most common breeds of locusts are actually kosher? Now, most of us don't eat them, but there are two countries where Jews do eat locusts. One is Yemen and one is Morocco. And the logic is very simple. Why did the Torah permit locusts? Because when there is a locust plague, what happens to the rest of the crops and the food, all the grains and the fruits? They get destroyed by the locusts. So if you did not eat locusts, what would happen? You would starve. So the Torah actually permits the consumption of locusts. There are certain signs that indicate whether they're kosher or not. And certain communities have preserved those signs because they need to. And indeed, in Yemen, locusts were eaten and still continue. There's very few Jews in Yemen left, but they continue to be eaten there. And they are an important source of protein. How were they generally eaten? First of all, they'd pull the head off. That way because the head is not really edible, and it disembowels the locust by pulling off the head because the guts come with it. So all you're left with is the actual meat part of the locust, which usually is fried in butter, because locusts are not fleishik. They're not meat. They have the status of like fish. They're not meaty. So they're fried in butter, ghee, which is a type of like a fermented butter from which you make baklava and other things like that. And they're spiced with cumin and ginger and pepper. And apparently they taste pretty good. I've never tasted them. Right. The other thing that people would do, the poorer Jews would dry them on their roofs. Would dry them on. Someone asked me not to send the recipe for locusts. I'm going to specifically send that to everyone individually. You shouldn't have said that. In any case, the poorer Jews would cook the locusts and then would dry the locusts and then grind them into a powder. So you'd have this like protein powder that, that weightlifters have. But it would be made of locusts, it was actually quite healthy and would save Jews from starvation in the years when the locusts would eat the crops. Another food which became very common amongst Jews was, of course, the bagel, which the Jews introduced, Eastern Europeans introduced into North America. I say North America because I'm talking here to Canadians. So the Jews introduced the bagel into North America, and the bagel basically is a food that is, I don't know what's happening to my camera tonight. I keep going out of focus. Sorry about that. Bagels, the dough is boiled first. It is then shaped into a ring. First it's shaped into a ring, then it's boiled. This way that all parts of it get boiled. And then when it's baked, you get the crispy outside and the chewy inside. And one of the reasons bagels were very popular, that Jews in Poland were extremely poor. And one of the theories is that and little boys, and we have there's actually a lot of evidence for this, but people would go out and boys would go out and they'd sell bagels on the street. Now you can carry a lot more bagels than you can bilkelach or rolls. Why can you carry a lot more bagels? Because they got the hole in the middle. So you could do a whole bunch of bagels on string, and I can carry like 100 bagels. But carrying rolls, they didn't have plastic bags, right? And a Hessian sack. There's a limit to how much you can carry. Bagels are fantastically portable. They stay fresh for a little longer, and they are delicious. And it was the food that the Jewish beggar boys would sell on the streets. Of course, they became very popular for sure in the United States. And there was a guy called Mayor Thompson of Los Angeles. And Thompson's son, who actually produced what's called the Thompson Bagel Machine, which is a machine that produced bagels. Now, there was another fellow, a guy called Harry Lender, who was a Jew from Lublin in Poland, who immigrated to New Haven, Connecticut. And he figured out a way that you could make bagels, freeze them really quickly, and then you could heat them up later, and they'd be still delicious and fresh. And that became the single most popular bagel in the United States became Lender's Bagels, which you can get at virtually, you can go into a supermarket in Arkansas. You can go into a Piggly Wiggly supermarket. That's actually the name, right? In somewhere in the deep south of the United States, where it's got a sign that says, "We treat you all like kin," right? And basically you can buy Lender's Bagels made by a Jew from Lublin in New Haven, Connecticut, to freeze them and to turn them into a delicious, delicious snack. Now, herring and pickles became heavy Jewish foods. That was primarily for economic reasons. Herring was extremely cheap. There was a time, beginning of the 20th century, about 30% of the herring catch in Europe was consumed by Jews. Right. And it was pickled because you had to pickle it. Why? You didn't have refrigeration, especially since on Fridays, Catholics would only eat fish. Jews would like to have fish for Shabbat. But the problem was, in a lot of places, Jews were not allowed to buy the good fish on Friday because it was reserved for the Catholics. So Jews would buy fish early in the week. You buy fish early in the week, the only way you can preserve it is by pickling or by smoking it. And that's how lox became although lox, according to some sociologists, and I cannot attest to this, but there is a sociologist, I think John Cooper quotes this in his book, that there are sociologists who believe that lox became popular amongst Jews in the United States, especially in New York, to have with cream cheese because it was the closest imitation they could get of something like ham and cheese. And so there was a little bit of jealousy. And there is actually an old custom of Jews eating foods that imitate non-kosher foods. In fact, almond milk is a very old Jewish dish that was made by Jews in Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, and all over the Mediterranean shores. They'd make almond milk, and almond milk gets mentioned in the Code of Jewish Law. In fact, Ramosha Isla says, if you are cooking meat with almond milk, make sure to garnish it with some slivers of almond so people do not suspect that you are cooking with actual milk, because milk and meat don't mix. So cheeseburgers are not a-Jewish. So, and that is something and that became another quintessential Jewish food, was the imitation of the non-Jewish, so to speak, meat and milk. And actually, there's a small town in Italy. I have a student there in Brindisi in the Amalfi Coast. And the Jews there had a dish called chazzarello. Chazzarello is a combination of Hebrew and Italian. What it means is little pig, which was a veal dish that was made to taste and smell and look exactly like you were eating pig. Now, challah, by the way, challah in biblical Hebrew, challah means a loaf. So hence what we have on Shabbat is called a loaf. Challah also in biblical Hebrew refers to you would take a segment of your dough and always give it to the kohen, to the priest. Nowadays, where the priests are not completely pure, they can't prove their purity. So instead of taking off a piece of the dough and giving it to a priest, to a kohen, we burn it. Okay. And the remainder is what we eat. It became a mitzvah, a custom for Jewish women to bake their own challah, their own loaves, or before Shabbat, and take off challah, take off a little bit of that. And hence the bread that we eat on Shabbos became known as challah because A, it's the loaf mentioned in the Torah, and B, it is also something from which we take that little piece of dough. Becher, someone mentioned, which is actually one of my favorite foods, very high in protein, and it's actually quite healthy. Becher is made from calves' feet. It's a jello made of calves' feet. And it's the calves' feet are cooked together with a lot of garlic and onion, and a jello is produced because of I forgot the name of the substance, and it is eaten cold on Shabbos. There's actually mentioned in Sefer Tamei HaMinhagim, the book Tamei HaMinhagim, and a lot of Hasidic rabbis mention it as being a very important food. They say why? Because what it indicates is you can take the lowest of lows and you can turn it into something absolutely fantastic, right? And so they say it symbolizes the elevation of the lowest levels of physicality to the highest levels of spirituality. And so Becher, I don't know if you like it, I personally do like it, but collagen, that's the substance. It's got it's high in protein and high in collagen, and it is actually a delicious food, but it's the type of thing not everyone likes. But it is a very quintessentially Jewish food. I'm gonna end with there's so many Jewish foods, but let me end with the following. This is a cookery book from North Africa and Andalusia from the 13th century. It's printed it was translated by Professor Lucia Bolins. It's a Jewish chicken recipe. The recipe is not so important, but it says the following: clean a chicken, mince the offal with almonds and breadcrumbs, flour, salt, fennel, coriander. Add beaten eggs and water. Put the chicken on the fire, and you stuff it with that stuff that we just described. Sounds amazing. Pour the stuffing all around. Garnish with some sprigs of fennel and rue, some sprigs of mint and ground almonds, and you are able to present it, God willing. Every recipe in the cookbook ends with the words, God willing. It's a great Andalusian 13th century Jewish cookbook, which is very beautifully written. And for many, many cooks, that is indeed an important part, is to pray that it will work out well. Anyway, but the fact that we are so into food is, I think, because we love life and God wants us to enjoy life. And the Torah wants us to take part in the pleasure of this world. And so we indeed take great pleasure in food, and we say blessings. Every time we eat, we say a blessing before, we say a blessing afterwards. It increases. And Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, in his famous book, the Kuzari, he points out that one of the reasons we say blessings is so that we enjoy the food more. Because when you contemplate not having something and you contemplate what you are having and you think about it and you are mindful when you eat it, he says you will enjoy it more. And he says when you enjoy it more and you are more grateful for it, you'll be a happier person. When you're a happier person, you're going to be a more moral person. The happier you are, the better you'll be, the less jealous you'll be, the less negative emotions you'll have, the less, right? The more charitable you'll be, right? You'll be looking at other people less. You will not engage. You won't be hedonic, what they call it, hedonic adaptation. You won't become bored with things. And he says, and therefore you'll be a happier and better person. And that's what God wants. So every time we eat, it's another opportunity to say a blessing. I remember I mentioned to a group of Israelis, I said that there is a Hasidic rabbi who says that the reason we eat is in order to say a blessing. So one of the Israelis said, he says, so why are so many Hasidim fat? So he says, if they're eating only to say blessings, I say they like to say a lot of blessings. And indeed, that is, but that's a little bit of an introduction to Jewish food. I would recommend two books. This tome here, it's called The Encyclopedia of Jewish Food by Gil Marks. It's about 800 pages, absolutely fantastic. And this other one is called Eat and Be Satisfied by John Cooper. I think it's published by Oxford University Press. Both excellent. I will, God willing, send you an outline with a lot of the information that I gave you here, and it'll have some of those recipes involved. And also, I think I have a short bibliography. Yes, I do. I have a suggested reading as well on that. So it's been great. This is the 6th and final class for the moment. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for having me, Rabbi Carfunkel, Rabbi Bookbinder. Greatly appreciate it. It's been wonderful. Thank you very much.
Rabbi, amazing. We enjoy you. I don't know how you get so much information to such a short time. And with your one-liners, like, I don't even think I catched all the one-liners, but you're amazing. Everyone, we're going into lockdown for another month, so we're going to make another game plan. This has really been amazing. I really thought we would, we would get 2 or 3 people, 5 people. We had such a nice turnout for all 6 classes. Obviously, it's because everyone's interested in knowledge, and we had a great presenter. So to Rabbi Becher, to everyone, I wish everyone an amazing, amazing week. Thank you so much for studying Torah with all of us together, and be well. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Rabbi Becher.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Thank you, Rabbi Becher.
Thank you.
Ellen, great to see you.
Thank you.
Jillian,
Thank
my
you so
cousin.
much. It was great.
Yep.
I'm hungry.
Thank
Who
you,
said
Rabbi.
that was great?
It was marvelous. A great idea.
Me, Terry.
Bunch of class.
Terry, thank you.
Yeah.
I loved his rendition of Nachman's chocolate tort with a hint of raspberries. That's phenomenal.
The way he describes things, it's amazing. It's amazing. There's Australians that have wit, Joe. What do you think? Speechless.
I just want to put a plug out there that we have this great program coming up starting January. Shimona Petrov has really been helping head it up. And if you enjoy Jewish gastronomy, it's going to be tied in with food and travel. And, you know, Shimona, can I just ask you to give a quick blurb about it, maybe just a shout out so people will know to look out for it?
Sure, yes, thank you. So it's going to be a program to replace traveling to winter getaways, and a program that allows us all to eat together. We're going to have a meal catered by Eli's Fine Foods. It will be themed based on the destination that we are virtually traveling to. We have a speaker who's an expert on the destination. We'll be speaking about places there and Jewish life there and all kinds of interesting things and food there probably. And hopefully it'll be a lot of fun. We're going to a place in Mexico, Brazil,
Israel.
well, of course, Israel, Pesach in Israel, that's the last one. And the Canadian Rockies. So hopefully you'll all join.
Yes.
All right.
Thank
So
you, Shimona.
we have to look out for that flyer that's coming out very soon, and there'll be a registration and sign up available on the web.
Good, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Be well.
Thank you.
Thank you, stay
everyone.
safe.
Yeah.
Stay safe. Amen.
Man.